In 1998, workers restoring the old St. Martin Parish Courthouse in Louisiana uncovered a sealed room beneath the foundation. Inside were water-damaged ledgers, church books, and plantation records that had not been touched for over a century. At first, historians thought they had simply found forgotten baptismal registers. But when they opened the pages, they realized something was terribly wrong. These records listed more than 200 enslaved people from 7 plantations along Bayou Teche. That alone was not unusual. What shocked everyone were the surnames written in careful ink beside the word slave. Dupree, Beaumont, Desnoyer. These were not common names. These were names that opened doors in New Orleans society. Names tied to sugar fortunes, political power, and generations of Louisiana's wealthiest white Creole families. Yet here they were, written next to auction prices. Written next to physical descriptions. Written next to chains. And someone had tried very hard to make sure no one ever saw them. Before we go any further, if you are fascinated by hidden histories, buried truths, and the dark secrets that powerful families never wanted exposed, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. And I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments. These stories connect us across time and place. Now let us go back to Bayou Teche. In the 1840s, St. Martin Parish existed in a world unlike anywhere else in the American South. This was not Mississippi cotton country or Virginia tobacco land. Louisiana's Bayou region followed older rules shaped by French and Spanish colonial law, Catholic tradition, and a social system far more complicated and far more fragile than outsiders understood. Here lived Acadian settlers, French Creoles, Spanish merchants, free people of color who owned land and businesses, and enslaved Africans whose lives were tied to sugar plantations that made fortunes during harvest season. French was spoken as often as English. Catholic feast days mattered as much as planting cycles. And old colonial customs quietly overruled newer American laws. Bayou Teche cut through the parish like a dark ribbon. Cypress trees draped in Spanish moss reflected in slow-moving water. Sugar plantations lined the banks, their fields stretching as far as the eye could see. During grinding season, the air smelled sweet with crushed cane. In summer, the swamp brought heat, insects, and sickness that sent wealthy families fleeing to New Orleans. One of the largest estates along the bayou belonged to the Desnoyer family. The Desnoyer plantation covered nearly 3,000 acres of prime sugarcane land. It produced enough sugar each year to support a lavish townhouse in New Orleans and secure the family's position among Louisiana's elite. Émile Desnoyer, the current owner, considered himself modern and educated. He studied agricultural journals, traveled abroad, and prided himself on efficiency and progress. To the north lived the Beaumont family. To the south, the Dupree. The 3 families were inseparable in society. Their wives served on charity boards. Their children attended the same private academies. They shared pews at St. Louis Cathedral and tables at the finest dinners in New Orleans. But back in St. Martin Parish, in plantation records and church ledgers, something strange was happening. On the Desnoyer plantation lived an enslaved man named Jean-Baptiste Desnoyer. He was born on the property in 1814. His mother, Marie Desnoyer, was born there in 1789. 3 generations had lived and died on that land, all carrying the same surname as the white family that claimed to own them. On the Beaumont plantation, records showed an enslaved family named Beaumont. Pierre Beaumont, his wife Catherine, and their 5 children. 3 generations, all enslaved, all carrying the Beaumont name. On the Dupree plantation, there were even more. 12 enslaved people across 2 family lines, every one of them recorded with the surname Dupree. These names appeared again and again in baptismal records kept by Father Rousseau at St. Martin de Tours Church. He baptized enslaved infants using full names. He recorded marriages. He noted deaths. He never questioned the surnames. Perhaps he believed they were the result of unspoken relationships between planters and enslaved women. Such relationships were common, though never discussed openly. Perhaps he assumed it was local custom. Or perhaps he knew exactly what those names meant and chose silence. The enslaved community understood. They knew why they carried those names. They passed the meaning down carefully, quietly, generation by generation. On Sunday afternoons, during rare moments of rest, enslaved families gathered across plantation lines. The Desnoyers sought out the Beaumonts. The Dupré found others who carried surnames that mirrored the names on the big houses. They remembered together. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyer lived in the quarters with his wife Marguerite and their 3 children. He was the head cooper on the plantation, a skilled craftsman responsible for making sugar barrels. Without him, the harvest could not be stored or shipped. His work made him essential. He learned the trade from his father. His father learned it from his grandfather. Skills were passed down as carefully as their name. Jean-Baptiste was cautious. He kept his head down. He taught his sons to work hard and say little. But he also taught them something else. Remember who you are. Remember the name. Remember why it matters. Émile Desnoyer knew about Jean-Baptiste. It was impossible not to. They shared a surname. They shared land. They crossed paths almost daily. But Émile perfected the art of not seeing. He called Jean-Baptiste by his first name only. In letters and ledgers, he was listed simply as the cooper. His surname was erased from plantation records, even though church documents preserved it clearly. The same silence existed across neighboring plantations. In polite society, the subject never lasted more than a sentence. Someone might mention it as a curiosity of the old colonial system. Another would blame careless priests. Then the conversation would move on to sugar prices, Paris fashion, or politics. But beneath that surface, something dangerous was growing. The enslaved families with French surnames were keeping a history that the white families feared more than rebellion. A history written not in ink, but in memory. And what they remembered threatened to expose a truth Louisiana's plantation aristocracy had buried for nearly 200 years. In the next part, we uncover where these names truly came from and why the families who owned everything feared them more than chains. If this story pulled you in, please like, share, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you are listening from. Your voice keeps these hidden histories alive. Part 2. The Lawyer Who Asked the Wrong Questions. The disruption did not come from a rebellion. It did not come from violence. It came from a young man with a pen, a law book, and a dangerous belief that the truth could protect him. On a heavy June morning in 1847, a stranger arrived in St. Martinville. The air was thick with heat and mosquitoes, the kind that soaked clothing within minutes. His name was Charles Porter, a 26-year-old lawyer from Massachusetts, sent south by an abolitionist society in Boston. His mission seemed simple: investigate reports that free people of color in Louisiana were being stripped of their legal status through fraud. Porter believed he was stepping into a clear case of injustice that could be documented, exposed, and corrected. He had no idea where he was. Porter rented a small room at the town's modest hotel and immediately began reviewing public records at the courthouse. Louisiana law allowed access to deeds, court proceedings, and parish documents. Everything Porter did at first was completely legal. For days he copied names, dates, transfers of land, and ownership records. He searched for proof that free people had been illegally enslaved. Instead, he found something that stopped him cold. The baptismal and marriage records did not make sense. Enslaved people had surnames. Not just any surnames. Powerful surnames. The same names written on the grand plantation gates lining Bayou Teche. Desnoyer, Beaumont, Dupré. In Massachusetts, enslaved people did not carry the names of wealthy families unless something illegal had occurred. Porter assumed he had uncovered massive fraud. He believed free people of color had been quietly reclassified as slaves, their freedom papers destroyed, their identities rewritten through corruption. He was wrong, but his mistake would shake St. Martin Parish in ways the plantation families had spent generations preventing. Porter began interviewing free people of color in St. Martinville. He showed them the copied records and asked if they knew the enslaved individuals with those surnames. The responses unsettled him. People grew nervous. Conversations ended quickly. Some claimed ignorance. Others suggested he misunderstood local customs. More than one person gently advised him to speak with the parish priest. Father Rousseau received Porter in the rectory beside St. Martin de Tours Church. The priest was polite but guarded. When Porter spread his copied records across the table, pointing to names and dates, Father Rousseau listened without interruption. Monsieur Porter, he finally said, Louisiana is not Massachusetts. Our history is older, more complicated. But Father, Porter insisted, these records show enslaved families carrying the same names as their owners. Across generations. Does that not suggest illegal enslavement? The priest folded his hands. The church records what is presented to us. We baptize children under the names their parents give. Legal status is not our concern. Porter pressed harder. Why would the church allow such an obvious injustice? Father Rousseau's voice cooled. Young man, you are making assumptions about matters you do not understand. It would be wise to conclude your work here. Porter did not listen. Instead, he made his most dangerous decision. He began visiting plantations. He requested to speak directly with enslaved people whose names appeared in the church records. In Louisiana, this crossed an invisible but absolute line. Plantation owners tolerated many things. This was not one of them. Émile Desnoyers received Porter's calling card late one afternoon. The request was formal, polite, dangerous. Émile read it slowly, then again. His jaw tightened. Within hours, messages were sent to neighboring plantations. Beaumont, Dupree, others whose names appeared in the records Porter had copied. That evening, 6 men gathered in Émile's study. Ledgers lined the walls. The room smelled of brandy and tobacco. No one sat. They read the card in silence. He thinks he's found free people illegally enslaved, Jacques Dupree said. He does not understand what he has found, François Beaumont replied. Then we must ensure he never does, Émile said quietly. They all understood the risk. Those surnames were not mistakes. They were not accidents. They were evidence of something older, something deeply buried. The arrangement. No one said the word aloud. They did not need to. They discussed their options carefully. The records Porter copied were public. But his presence on plantations could be framed as trespassing. As incitement. Émile made the decision. The sheriff would be informed. Porter would be escorted out of the parish. Sheriff LeBlanc handled it professionally. 3 days later, he met Porter on the road east. The conversation was calm, polite, firm. Your work here is creating unrest. For your safety, it would be best if you continue elsewhere. Porter argued. He threatened to publish everything. He promised Boston would hear about this. The sheriff pointed toward the road. Porter left. Before leaving Louisiana, Porter mailed a long report to his abolitionist society. It included copied records and his theory of systematic fraud. Portions were published in a northern newspaper. The reaction was muted. Northern readers already believed slavery was evil. Surnames seemed like a small detail in a brutal system. The story faded. In St. Martin Parish, balance returned. But not in the quarters. The enslaved families knew something had changed. An outsider had noticed the names. Asked questions. Been removed. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers heard about Porter from others who worked in town. He listened carefully, said little. On a Sunday afternoon, beneath cypress trees near the bayou, Jean-Baptiste met with Pierre Beaumont and Louis Dupree. Fishing poles rested in their hands as cover. Their real purpose was conversation. The Boston man thought the names meant freedom papers, Louis said. He understood nothing, Pierre replied. Jean-Baptiste stared at the water. My grandfather told me we carry these names for a reason. He said we must remember. We must wait. Wait for what? Louis asked. Jean-Baptiste shook his head. He never said. But all 3 men understood one thing. Their names had survived slavery, silence, and erasure for generations. And they were meant to survive whatever came next. In Part 3, we go back to the French colonial era to uncover where these names truly came from and why they were never meant to disappear. If this story pulled you in, please subscribe, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Part 3. The secret buried in the strongbox. Some secrets are meant to survive centuries. Others are buried so carefully that only a single curious mind can uncover them. In 1856, that mind belonged to Philippe Desnoyers. He had returned from Paris with the polish of European education and a fascination with law. At 23, he understood the logic of legal systems in a way few in Louisiana did. But nothing in his studies could have prepared him for what he would discover in the plantation office of his family estate. The office was quiet that humid July afternoon, lit by shafts of sunlight filtering through the shutters. Stacks of ledgers leaned in careful disorder. Old correspondence, some yellowed with age, crowded the shelves. Philippe moved methodically, cataloging records, cross-checking deeds, and organizing papers that spanned generations. In the back of a tall cabinet, he found it. A metal strongbox, locked but clearly long forgotten. The key hung on a nail above it. Philippe could hardly believe his luck. This was not a casual discovery. This was a door into the past, a doorway that no one had opened for decades. Inside were documents written in elegant French, dating back to the 1780s and 1790s. Most were mundane: dowry agreements, property transfers, commercial contracts. But one document made Philippe stop in his tracks. It was a manumission paper from 1791, granting freedom to a woman named Marie, described as a mulatresse of the Desnoyers household. The document explicitly named her children, Jean and Baptiste Desnoyer, and guaranteed their status as free. It was signed by Philippe's great-great-grandfather, Etienne Desnoyers, and countersigned by a Spanish colonial official. Philippe's heart sank. He understood the significance. Spanish law required that manumissions be registered with the Cabildo in New Orleans to be valid. These papers had never been filed. For 65 years, someone had kept them hidden, deliberately unrecorded. As he sifted through the strongbox, Philippe discovered more, 3 additional unregistered manumission papers, all following the same pattern. Freedom granted to enslaved women of the household, children named, status recognized. All were legally valid under the colonial system, but invisible under American law. Then Philippe found a letter, written in his great-great-grandfather's hand, dated 1803. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost hypnotic in its precision. "My son," it began, "you will find in this box certain documents pertaining to arrangements made under the Spanish system. These arrangements were legal under Spanish law and the Code Noir, which recognized the rights of natural children to carry their father's surname and inherit status according to certain conditions. However, the American legal system does not recognize these distinctions in the same manner. The Americans are more rigid in their categories, less accommodating of the complexities that existed under our French and Spanish governance. I have decided not to register these manumission papers with the new American authorities." Philippe's hands trembled. The letter went on. The women named in these documents had been promised education, training, and security within the Desnoyer household. Their children would carry the Desnoyer name. The family's reasoning was clear. Legal freedom in the American system would expose them to dangers they could not survive. To protect them, they would remain enslaved, at least on paper. Philippe read and reread the words. He understood what his family had done. The rationalizations about protection, education, and preservation could not hide the truth. Etienne Desnoyers had deliberately kept people enslaved who should have been free by law. And these were not abstractions. These were living descendants. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers, the plantation cooper whose skill kept the sugar harvest intact, was a great-great-grandson of the children named in these long-forgotten manumission papers. For the first time, Philippe fully grasped the moral weight of the secret his family had carried. Their wealth, their social standing, their connections in New Orleans, all had been built in part on labor that should never have been enslaved. When his father, Émile Desnoyers, entered the office, Philippe laid out the documents. The elder Desnoyer studied them carefully, eyes narrowing as recognition passed across his face. "I knew there were arrangements in the old times," Émile admitted. "My father mentioned them once. He said the details were best left undisturbed." "But father," Philippe pressed, "these people should be free. Under Spanish law, under French law, under the documents themselves." Émile's voice hardened. "Do you understand what would happen if we recognized these manumissions now? Every family in Louisiana with any connection to the colonial period would face claims. Lawsuits, challenges to property, the disruption of plantations. Every family that built its fortune during the French and Spanish eras would be forced to reckon with the consequences. Philippe felt the room close in around him. The horror of the realization was almost physical. For decades, the plantation families had manipulated law and custom, bending them to protect wealth and power. They had hidden legal documents to ensure control over lives that were never theirs to control. The silence stretched between father and son. Philippe understood the practical impossibility of correcting the injustice. But he could not unsee it. He could not unknow what he held in his hands. In the quarters, the enslaved Desnoyers, the Beaumonts, and the Dupré continued their lives, unaware of the revelation unfolding in the main house. They carried their names carefully, passed them down, whispered them to children, knowing only that the names mattered, but never why. Philippe realized that the documents explained the mystery he had felt even as a child, the tension in the air, the hushed instructions of elders, the names preserved against all reason. The surnames were not mistakes. They were the shadow of freedom deferred. The realization left Philippe in a liminal space between horror and fascination. Here was proof of systematic deceit that spanned generations. The moral and legal implications were staggering. But what could one man do in 1856 Louisiana? He closed the strongbox carefully. The documents would stay there for now. The secret would remain buried for another generation. But Philippe's eyes lingered on the papers longer than necessary, knowing that the truth could never fully be erased. In the weeks that followed, he could not stop thinking of Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers at the cooper's bench, shaping barrels with skilled hands, carrying the weight of a name that should have meant freedom, yet existed in bondage. He thought of the whispered stories passed down in the quarters, the fragments of memory that had preserved knowledge even when law and custom had tried to erase it. The seeds of understanding, planted centuries before, were alive. And one day, Philippe knew, they would grow into a reckoning. If this story has drawn you in, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves hidden histories and family secrets that defy time. Leave your city or state in the comments so we can see how far this story reaches. The next part takes us deeper into the lives of Jean-Baptiste and the families whose names carried a secret they did not yet understand. If you want, I can write part 4 next, where we follow Jean-Baptiste and the enslaved families themselves, showing how the names shaped their survival and identity while the secret hovered over them like a shadow. Do you want me to continue with part 4? Part 4. The names they could not forget. Some secrets do not live in documents or letters. They live in memory. They live in whispers passed from parent to child. They live in names. For the enslaved families along Bayou Teche, those names were more than identifiers. They were survival. They were history. They were warnings. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers woke before sunrise, as he had for most of his 42 years. The air was thick with humidity and the distant smell of sugarcane being cut. He stepped outside his modest quarters, listening to the sound of the bayou as it curved silently through the plantation. His 3 children stirred inside, and he took a moment to watch them sleep. He carried a name that most people assumed was borrowed from the wealthy Desnoyer family that owned the land. But Jean-Baptiste knew the truth. That name was his. It belonged to him by blood, by ancestry, by the careful preservation of a story too dangerous to speak aloud. The older men in the quarters sometimes whispered about the past. Stories that stretched back before the Louisiana Purchase. Stories about the Spanish and French colonial laws that once recognized children of enslaved women and white men as legally free. Stories about arrangements that were never honored under American rule. But the reasons were fragmented. Pieces were missing. Jean-Baptiste knew to listen carefully. He had heard enough to understand that their survival depended on memory. Names were their map to history, a history that the plantation families had tried to erase but had not fully succeeded in hiding. On this morning, as the sun rose over the cypress trees, Jean-Baptiste met Pierre Beaumont and Louis Dupré at a familiar spot along the bayou. The water reflected the orange light, and fish broke the surface with quiet splashes. Fishing poles were in their hands, but the pretense of leisure was thin. Louis spoke first. "The Boston man," he said quietly, "the one who came asking questions, he thinks he knows something." Jean-Baptiste nodded. They had all heard about Charles Porter. Stories from those who had seen him in town. A young lawyer from Massachusetts who believed their names meant freedom. A dangerous man who had been escorted out of the parish. Pierre shook his head. He understood only fragments. Names mean something, but not what he thinks. Jean-Baptiste traced his finger along the surface of the water. My grandfather, he said, told me to remember. To carry the names. To teach the children. He never said why exactly. But it is important. The three men sat in silence. Even with the plantation owners blind to these conversations, even with the constant threat of punishment, the names persisted. They passed them quietly, in whispers, to the next generation. Jean-Baptiste's eldest son, Henri, approached and joined them. He was 13 but already showed skill with the carpentry tools that Jean-Baptiste had taught him. The boy knew the names. He knew they were important, though not why. He would learn later. For now, he listened. Every Sunday, when chores were lighter, families from neighboring plantations gathered in hidden spots. Children played in the reeds, women exchanged small gifts or tips about tending the fields, and the men spoke carefully about survival and history. Names were shared with reverence. No one outside the quarters could know the meaning. Jean-Baptiste knew the story in pieces. There had been promises under French and Spanish law. Legal papers that granted freedom. Documents that should have been registered. Papers that had been deliberately hidden by the families in power. Freedom deferred for decades. Protection used as an excuse for control. He thought about Philippe Desnoyers, the young heir who had recently returned from Paris. He wondered if Philippe had any idea of what life was like in the quarters. He wondered if he understood the weight of a surname when it was a chain and a lifeline at the same time. The men knew that the plantation owners had their reasons. Protection, stability, wealth, social order. The reasons were tangled with law, custom, and fear. But in the quarters, the reason was simple. Names were proof. Names were memory. Names were identity. That afternoon, Jean-Baptiste went to work at the cooper's shop. Barrels for sugar were stacked along the walls, and the smell of freshly cured wood filled the air. His hands moved with skill and precision, each barrel a testament to labor and survival. Children watched and learned. Every cut of the saw, every bend of the wood, every finished barrel was instruction, but it was also ritual. Work preserved the body while names preserved the soul. When he paused for a moment, he thought of the old stories. Of Marie, of Jean and Baptiste Desnoyers, whose freedom had been promised but never granted. Of the documents hidden in a strongbox on the plantation. Of the man from Massachusetts who had tried to ask the wrong questions. He understood that he and his peers carried both memory and responsibility. One day, these names might matter in ways they could not yet imagine. One day, the truth might emerge in full, and the stories of their families could no longer be suppressed. That evening, the families gathered again near the bayou. Children were sent to collect firewood, women prepared a simple meal, and the men spoke quietly about survival. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and sugar cane, the low hum of insects filling the gaps in conversation. Louis leaned closer to Jean-Baptiste. The Boston man's questions, he said, disturbed some things. People are paying attention now, even if they do not fully understand. Jean-Baptiste nodded. Our names are not just letters, he said. They are maps. They are memory. We pass them down. We protect them. One day, the world will understand why. Pierre added quietly, my grandfather said the same. We remember. That is enough for now. They knew that for decades, the plantation families had manipulated law, religion, and tradition to protect their own wealth and power. But the enslaved families had also preserved something equally powerful. Memory. Identity. Names that could not be erased completely. As night fell over Bayou Teche, the men returned to their quarters. Children slept, women whispered to each other, and the shadows of cypress trees stretched over the water. The river carried secrets, but the names lived on. They were whispered, remembered, and taught with care. The secret of their identity was safe, for now. But the undercurrent of history and law that bound them could not be ignored forever. In the next part, we return to the Desnoyers household to explore how Philippe and Émile wrestled with the truth they had uncovered and the impossible choices they faced. The hidden manumission papers were more than historical documents. They were a threat to the power and wealth that had been preserved for generations. If this story is captivating you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves hidden histories. Leave your city or state in the comments so we can see how far this story reaches. These names, these families, and these secrets connect us across time. If you want, I can continue with part 5, where we begin the tension between the Desnoyer family and the enslaved families intensifies, setting the stage for a crisis in the parish. Do you want me to write part 5 next? Part 5, the tension that could not be ignored. In St. Martin Parish, secrets were like shadows. They stretched long in the sunlight, hid in corners of rooms, and waited patiently for someone to stumble over them. By 1856, that shadow had grown heavy. Philippe Desnoyers could not stop thinking about what he had found in the strongbox. Manumission papers unfiled, letters explaining why families were kept in bondage, and the weight of generations built on broken promises. The knowledge pressed down on him like the Louisiana heat in July. He knew the truth, but he also knew its danger. Revealing it could destroy his family's wealth. It could provoke lawsuits, unrest, even violence. Yet he could not unsee what he had seen. Every time he walked past the cooper's shop, he remembered Jean-Baptiste, strong, silent, and skilled, carrying a name that should have meant freedom. That afternoon, Philippe found his father, Émile, in the main house. The older man was seated at his desk, reviewing ledgers from the sugar harvest. His eyes narrowed as Philippe approached, carrying the weight of questions no son should ask lightly. "Father," Philippe began carefully, "the documents. The papers in the strongbox. What do we do with them?" Émile set down the pen he had been using to calculate yields. "We do nothing," he said. "They are old documents. Irrelevant under American law. The people concerned are ours to manage. That is how it has always been." Philippe's hands trembled. "But father, they should be free. The documents, the law at the time, the Code Noir, all of it. They are entitled to their freedom." Émile's expression hardened. "Do you understand what would happen if we freed them now? Every family that owned plantations would face claims. The courts would be flooded. Our wealth, our social position, everything built by our ancestors would be questioned. It is not a matter of morality, Philippe. It is survival." Philippe left the office, troubled. The rationalizations made sense on paper, but they did not ease the weight on his conscience. Outside, the heat of the day pressed down. The bayou was quiet except for the hum of insects and the distant calls of birds. Meanwhile, in the quarters, life carried on, unaware of the discovery in the plantation office. Jean-Baptiste and the other heads of the enslaved families continued their Sunday gathering by the bayou. They spoke quietly, fishing poles resting in their hands as cover. "The Boston man," Louis whispered, "the one who came asking questions, he might return one day." Jean-Baptiste nodded. "Names are stronger than outsiders. They last longer than fear. They survive, even when we cannot." The conversation drifted to daily life, to work in the fields, to the skill of passing knowledge to the next generation. Children watched and listened, learning the stories encoded in names, learning how to survive while remembering. Tension began to rise in the parish, though no one spoke of it openly. Slavery debates in Washington reached even the quietest corners of Louisiana. News of the Kansas-Nebraska Act reached St. Martin Parish. Plantation owners whispered at social gatherings in New Orleans. Their wealth depended on labor and social order. Change threatened everything. Émile and the other plantation owners grew nervous. They reviewed ledgers, reinforced security, and reminded overseers to monitor conversations among the enslaved. Every Sunday gathering, every whispered name, every careful passing of memory became a potential spark they feared. Philippe, increasingly uneasy, returned to the strongbox repeatedly. He read the manumission papers, the letters, the calculations of generations. He tried to imagine what freedom would mean for Jean-Baptiste and the others. He considered that his family's fortune rested on the labor of people who should have been free decades ago. The moral weight pressed on him like a storm cloud over the bayou. One evening, Philippe confronted his father again. "Father," he said, "you knew what they were promised. You knew the documents existed. Are we protecting them, or are we using them?" Emil's voice was calm, almost too calm. We are preserving stability. That is the only way to prevent chaos. We offer protection, education, and security. Freedom would expose them to dangers they cannot survive in this society. It is the practical choice. Philippe felt a rage he could not speak aloud. Practicality, stability, protection, these words sounded like excuses for cruelty. Yet he understood, too, that changing anything now could endanger lives, including their own. As the sun set over the bayou, shadows lengthened in the quarters. Jean-Baptiste watched his children play near the water. He thought about the past, about Marie, about Jean and Baptiste Desnoyers, and about the strength it took to carry a name through centuries of oppression. He understood that names were their inheritance, their shield, their map. The secret of the surnames persisted because the plantation families had deliberately left them in place. It was a fragile balance. The enslaved knew something the white families tried to hide. The white families knew that the enslaved knew, but no one dared speak openly. That night, Philippe could not sleep. He thought about the impossibility of justice in the present, about the lives shaped by decisions made decades before. He thought about Jean-Baptiste, about the resilience that survived in the quarters, about the names that would continue to be whispered even if no one else understood. The tension was palpable. A single wrong move could unravel everything. A lawyer from the north, a public revelation, a misstep in understanding the old colonial laws, any of it could ignite conflict. But for now, the balance held. The quarters remained vigilant, the names continued to be passed down, and the strongbox in the plantation office remained locked. The secret waited, patient and silent, for the moment when the weight of truth could no longer be ignored. In the next part, we explore the first stirrings of unrest among the enslaved families and how the knowledge of their surnames begins to influence their decisions, their strategies, and their hopes for the future. If this story has gripped your imagination, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves dark hidden histories. Leave your city or state in the comments to show how far this story reaches. The names, the families, and the secrets connect generations across time and space. If you want, I can continue with part 6, where the tension escalates as the enslaved families begin to take calculated risks to preserve their identity and knowledge while the plantation owners remain unaware. Do you want me to continue with part 6? Part 6. Whispers of Rebellion. Some truths live quietly for generations, waiting for the right moment to stir. On Bayou Teche, in 1857, that moment was approaching. The enslaved families had carried their surnames like a secret map for decades. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers knew the weight of that knowledge. It was more than a name. It was history. It was survival. And now, whispers in the quarters suggested that others were beginning to connect the dots. It began subtly. Children repeated names in hushed tones, older women reminded them to remember, to pass down the stories accurately, and young men listened with growing understanding. These were not just words. They were a code, a way to know who they were and where they came from, even as the plantation owners tried to erase the past. Jean-Baptiste met with Pierre Beaumont and Louis Dupree near the bayou one late afternoon. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and sugarcane. The men cast careful glances toward the fields, where overseers moved with authority, unaware that beneath their feet a quiet resistance was forming. "We must be careful," Pierre said. "Names are powerful, but knowledge is dangerous." Louis nodded. "The Boston man," he said, "could return. Others from the north could come asking questions. The plantation families would not tolerate that. They will act." Jean-Baptiste looked down at the water, thinking of the generations before him. "My grandfather told me that the names were a shield," he said. "They protect us as much as they remind us. But he also said that the day would come when we could use them." The men shared strategies in whispered conversations. They discussed how to pass knowledge to the children safely. They taught them to recognize patterns in the baptismal records without revealing the full truth. Every story, every name, every careful reminder became part of a hidden curriculum. It was survival through memory. Meanwhile, in the Desnoyers household, Philippe wrestled with the strongbox documents. The papers revealed an injustice decades old, one that had been meticulously hidden. Each unregistered manumission, each letter explaining the rationale, not at his conscience. He understood the practical dangers of acting. Freeing the families could spark lawsuits, disrupt sugar production, and threaten the carefully maintained social order. Yet he could not ignore the truth. The knowledge he had uncovered burned inside him, demanding recognition. Emile, ever cautious, noticed his son's unease. "You must understand," he said, "there are limits to what we can do. Laws, society, and custom constrain us. The past cannot always dictate the present." Philippe could not accept that. The injustice was tangible. It was in the quarters, in the work of the coopers, in the whispered names, in the generations of people who had never known the freedom promised to them. He resolved to find a way to act without destroying everything around him. In the quarters, the enslaved families began to experiment cautiously. They tested small risks, such as leaving subtle marks on barrels or weaving messages into cloth patterns. Children were taught to recognize the names of ancestors and to associate them with stories, skills, and lessons. It was subtle, nearly invisible, but it allowed the families to assert identity without attracting attention. Jean-Baptiste's youngest son, Henri, proved particularly attentive. He memorized the names and stories, repeating them in song and rhyme, a method that ensured they would survive even if adults were not present to teach them. Music became a vessel for memory. Every melody carried lessons about history, survival, and dignity. One evening, as the men gathered near the bayou, a young woman approached with news. Word had spread that a new overseer was questioning certain families about their lineage. The men realized that even the careful strategies they had employed could not entirely prevent intrusion. Awareness had grown, and with it, the risk. Jean-Baptiste spoke to the group. "We must adapt," he said. "Names alone are not enough. We must combine caution with cleverness. We cannot reveal everything at once. But we can prepare the next generation to carry the story forward safely." Pierre and Louis agreed. They would continue teaching children, passing down the knowledge, and watching for any outsiders who might threaten their fragile security. Every detail, every surname, every story was now part of a living strategy. Meanwhile, Philippe Desnoyers began to act in his own way. He sought to understand the people in the quarters beyond their roles as laborers. He observed their skills, their interactions, their strength. He began quietly documenting the oral histories he heard from older individuals, recording the stories of names, relationships, and lineage in private journals. He did not share these records with anyone. He knew that revealing the full truth could be dangerous, both for him and for the families he observed. Yet he could not ignore the moral imperative to preserve knowledge that had been deliberately hidden. The plantation remained a tense equilibrium. Sugar production continued, overseers maintained control, and the Desnoyer family projected an image of order. Yet beneath the surface, knowledge and identity thrived quietly in the quarters. Names carried power, and the families who bore them understood their significance more than any outsider could. One hot August evening, as the sun set over the bayou, Jean-Baptiste reflected on the precarious balance. The past and present intertwined in the shadows of the cypress trees. The names were more than history, they were strategy, culture, and survival all in one. He thought of Philippe, of the young man who understood the injustice but struggled to act. He thought of his own children, of the children of the Dupré and the Beaumonts, all learning to carry the weight of a name. The future was uncertain, but the knowledge survived. The air of tension, the silent strategies, and the preservation of identity created a quiet form of resistance. It was subtle, invisible, and unrecognized by the white families who believed they controlled everything. Yet power had shifted, if only in potential. The enslaved families had begun to wield influence through memory, through names, and through the careful preservation of history. In the next part, we explore the first major challenge to this balance. Outside forces, unaware of the fragile strategy in place, begin to apply pressure. The plantation families, the quarter families, and Philippe himself are forced to make decisions that will test loyalty, courage, and the survival of hidden truths. If this story has captured your attention, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves untold histories and family secrets. Leave your city or state in the comments to show how far this story reaches. The names, the memories, and the secrets of Bayou Tech connect generations across time. If you want, I can write part 7 next, where the tension escalates further as an external threat forces the plantation families and the enslaved families to confront the consequences of centuries-old decisions. Do you want me to continue with part 7? Part 7. A Threat Beyond the Bayou. The calm of St. Martin Parish was always deceptive. On the surface, the sugarcane swayed in the humid breeze, overseers barked orders, and the plantation families maintained appearances of order. But beneath that surface, tension had been building for years. Knowledge and memory, quietly preserved in the quarters, had grown stronger. In the summer of 1858, an unexpected threat arrived from outside the parish. A traveling journalist from New Orleans, interested in Louisiana's plantations and the lives of free people of color, came to St. Martinville. His name was Edward Whitaker, and his curiosity was insatiable. He had heard rumors of unusual family names among the enslaved and free Creole population and sought to investigate. Whitaker began asking questions at the parish courthouse, in the small shops along the main street, and in the homes of free people of color. Unlike Charles Porter years before, he was more subtle, more patient, more willing to listen and observe. The moment he mentioned surnames, a wave of tension rippled through the town. Word reached the quarters quickly. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers heard from a trusted friend that a man with a notebook and pen had been asking questions about families, names, and lineage. Pierre Beaumont, Louis Dupree, and Jean-Baptiste gathered near the bayou that evening. They discussed the threat cautiously. A journalist, Pierre said, could bring attention that none of us want. He could stir outsiders who do not understand our ways. Jean-Baptiste nodded. We have survived by remembering and by hiding, he said. We will survive again, but we must be careful. In the Desnoyer mansion, Philippe watched the news of Whitaker's arrival with a mixture of dread and curiosity. He recognized the danger the journalist posed. Whitaker was intelligent, persistent, and willing to speak to anyone. Philippe realized that if Whitaker learned too much, the delicate balance the plantation families had maintained for decades could unravel in a matter of days. Émile Desnoyers gathered the other plantation owners, including François Beaumont and Jacques Dupree, in his study. We have a visitor, Émile said. A journalist. He asks questions. He records answers. This could be dangerous. François frowned. What do we do? He asked. Émile leaned back in his chair. We monitor him. We guide him. We ensure he never learns more than what we want him to know. Nothing else. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the enslaved families understood that something had changed. Names alone would not protect them this time. They needed to act with greater caution, but they also recognized that the moment could be an opportunity. Knowledge, carefully preserved, could be used to influence events in subtle ways. Jean-Baptiste met with Henri and the other younger men. You must remember, he said. Everything we have been taught is not just history. It is protection. If he asks questions, answer carefully. Pass along what is necessary, but do not reveal too much. Henri listened intently. The boy had grown up learning the significance of their names, understanding the balance between memory and discretion. He understood that this moment required both courage and patience. Whitaker spent days visiting plantations, observing work in the fields, watching the coopers and carpenters, speaking to free people of color in town. He noted the names he heard, recorded the stories he was told, and began to suspect that something extraordinary was hidden behind the ordinary labor of the plantations. Philippe Desnoyers recognized the danger. He decided to act preemptively. He invited Whitaker to the Desnoyer house under the guise of providing insight into plantation management and the sugar industry. Philippe controlled the narrative carefully, steering conversations away from the quarters and toward economics, trade, and technology. Yet even as Philippe maintained the illusion, he documented what he observed. He noted which enslaved families maintained traditions, which children repeated stories and names, and how memory had survived despite generations of oppression. Philippe realized that the quarters were a living archive, far richer and more resilient than any ledger in his father's study. Outside, tension continued to grow. The plantation owners, aware of Whitaker's curiosity, reinforced rules for overseers, instructed them to watch interactions closely, and increased supervision of any gatherings. They believed control was absolute, yet they underestimated the quiet power of knowledge preserved in whispers and songs. One evening, Jean-Baptiste gathered with Pierre and Louis along the bayou. "The journalist is clever," he said. "He could provoke trouble if we are careless." Pierre frowned. "Trouble could bring discovery," he said. "We must decide how far we are willing to take risks." Jean-Baptiste looked at the water. "We have survived because our ancestors were careful," he said. "We have thrived because we remembered. Now we must survive again. But survival is not enough. We must ensure that our history is not lost, even if it must remain hidden for now." Louis nodded. "The names, the stories, the skills we pass down, all of it," he said, "is more important than any single moment. We protect what is ours through memory." As Whitaker continued his investigation, he noticed small patterns. Children repeating names in song. Adults leaving subtle marks on barrels and tools. Quiet interactions in the evenings near the bayou. He sensed that something was being preserved deliberately, though he could not understand the full significance. Philippe observed these patterns as well. He recognized the importance of passing down knowledge without drawing attention. The balance was fragile. A single misstep could lead to exposure, to conflict, to ruin. By the end of the summer, it was clear that the presence of Whitaker had shifted the dynamics of the parish. The enslaved families were more cautious, more deliberate in preserving memory. The plantation owners were more vigilant, more anxious. And Philippe was caught between his conscience and the expectations of his family and society. The stage was set for a confrontation, though no one yet knew the exact form it would take. Knowledge and memory had begun to assert power. The past, carefully buried in documents and names, was pushing toward the present. In the next part, we witness the first overt challenge to the hidden order as the enslaved families test boundaries, and Philippe faces a moral choice that could change the future of Bayou Tech forever. If this story has gripped your imagination, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves untold histories and secrets hidden in plain sight. Leave your city or state in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The names, the histories, and the secrets connect generations across time. If you want, I can continue with part 8 next, where the tension escalates dramatically, leading to direct challenges between the enslaved families and the plantation hierarchy. Do you want me to continue with part 8? Part 8. The Quiet Revolt. Sometimes the most dangerous revolutions are the ones nobody sees coming. On Bayou Tech in 1859, a quiet storm was brewing. For decades, the enslaved families of St. Martin Parish had carried their names like sacred maps. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers, Pierre Beaumont, and Louis Dupré understood that names were more than labels. They were history, power, and survival. Now, whispers had become plans. It began with small acts. A barrel marked subtly in the cooper's shop. A signal woven into a quilt. A story passed to a child that included just enough truth to ignite understanding. These acts seemed insignificant to the overseers and plantation owners, but they were the first sparks of defiance, a rebellion of memory and identity. Jean-Baptiste gathered the heads of the families one evening. The sun had just dipped below the bayou, and the air was thick with humidity. "We have survived because we remembered," he said. "Now we must ensure that memory survives in a way that strengthens us." Pierre Beaumont nodded. "But how do we do that without attracting attention?" he asked. Louis Dupré leaned forward. "Subtlety," he said. "Every child must learn the names, the stories, the skills. They must carry them forward. We cannot act openly, but we can act through knowledge." That night, children gathered around fires, learning to remember their lineage through song and storytelling. Jean-Baptiste taught them how to recognize patterns in the baptismal records and oral histories. Every lesson was a seed planted carefully, ensuring the next generation would know who they were, even if the world denied them that knowledge. Meanwhile, Philippe Desnoyers wrestled with his own conscience. He had seen the quiet defiance, understood the injustice of the unfiled manumission papers, and recognized the courage of the enslaved families. He wanted to help but feared the consequences. Freeing them openly could destroy his family's wealth and social standing. Remaining silent felt equally wrong. One afternoon, Philippe visited the quarters under the pretense of checking on the sugar barrels. He watched Jean-Baptiste instruct his sons in barrel making, noting their precision and speed. Every motion, every instruction, was a form of education and preservation of heritage. Philippe realized something crucial. These families were not waiting passively for freedom. They were preparing, training, and strategizing. They had turned the names, the skills, and the stories into a subtle form of power that the plantation owners could not see. In town, Edward Whittaker, the journalist, noticed small anomalies. Children repeating names, adults exchanging subtle signals, families teaching skills and stories that seemed oddly sophisticated for enslaved laborers. He began to suspect that he had stumbled upon something far more complex than ordinary plantation life. Back at the Desnoyer plantation, tension grew. Overseers reported minor incidents that were dismissed as accidents or coincidence. A barrel misplaced, a tool slightly altered, a child asking unusually insightful questions. The plantation owners grew uneasy, though they could not pinpoint the cause. Jean-Baptiste and his allies recognized the danger. The slightest mistake could expose them to punishment or worse. Yet they also recognized that the balance was shifting. The knowledge they carried had begun to give them leverage, a form of influence that could not be denied forever. They began coordinating subtly with trusted individuals on neighboring plantations. Messages were passed quietly, stories shared in coded language, and skills taught in ways that ensured survival even under scrutiny. The names became more than symbols. They became strategy, a way to protect themselves and prepare for the future. Philippe, increasingly conflicted, continued documenting the oral histories he observed. He understood that the stories, the names, and the strategies of the enslaved families were a living history, far more resilient than any document in his strongbox. One evening, Jean-Baptiste gathered everyone near the bayou. The reflection of the cypress trees shimmered in the water as he spoke. "We are not powerless," he said. "We have survived by remembering. We have thrived by teaching. And now, we must act carefully to ensure our children inherit knowledge that will keep them strong, safe, and proud." The families agreed. They would continue to teach, to pass down skills, to preserve stories. Every action was calculated, every lesson deliberate. They understood that true power lay not in open revolt, but in the quiet, invisible strength of memory, identity, and skill. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Philippe struggled with his choice. Should he intervene more directly, risk everything to free the families immediately, or should he continue observing and recording, ensuring that knowledge survived even if action was delayed? The stakes were clear. Any misstep could ignite violence, provoke retaliation, or destroy the careful balance maintained for decades. Yet the enslaved families had discovered their own form of agency, and their subtle resistance had begun to shift the dynamics of power on the plantation. As night fell, the air thick with humidity and the scent of sugarcane, Jean-Baptiste looked at the children playing quietly near the bayou. He understood that they were the next generation, inheritors of both struggle and knowledge. Their names, their history, and their skills would carry them forward, even as the world around them remained hostile. In the next part, the tension escalates as the plantation families begin to suspect the subtle defiance, and Philippe must make a decision that could change the lives of everyone on Bayou Teche. If this story has gripped your imagination, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves untold histories and hidden revolts. Leave your city or state in the comments to show how far this story reaches. The names, the memories, and the quiet resistance of Bayou Teche connect generations across time. If you want, I can write part 9 next, where the simmering tension erupts into confrontation and the hidden histories collide with the realities of plantation power. Do you want me to continue with part 9? Part 9. The storm breaks. Some secrets can only remain buried for so long. In 1860, on the banks of Bayou Teche, that fragile equilibrium shattered. For years, the enslaved families had relied on memory, subtle signals, and carefully preserved knowledge to protect themselves. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers, Pierre Beaumont, and Louis Dupree had taught their children to recognize their surnames as symbols of survival and identity. They had passed down skills, stories, and lessons with meticulous care. But the plantation owners had begun to notice strange patterns, small acts of defiance, and unusual gatherings had raised suspicions. Whispers in the overseers' quarters hinted at something deeper. The subtle revolt that had existed for decades was about to collide with the rigid hierarchy of Louisiana's plantation society. It began with a single incident. Henri Desnoyers, Jean-Baptiste's eldest son, was observed helping a younger boy from the Dupree plantation with barrel-making skills. The boy's father, an enslaved man who had quietly preserved knowledge of the family lineage, had instructed Henri to teach him. To an outsider, it looked like cooperation among enslaved laborers, but to those in the know, it was deliberate transmission of both skill and legacy. An overseer reported the incident to Émile Desnoyers. He read the account with growing concern. There were patterns emerging, he realized, patterns that suggested coordination among families across plantations. A meeting was called with the other owners, including François Beaumont and Jacques Dupree. They gathered in Émile's study, the smell of tobacco and candle wax filling the room. The quiet, calculated control they had maintained for decades was slipping. "We have a problem," Émile said. "These families are teaching, sharing knowledge, coordinating. This goes beyond idle chatter or simple work." Jacques Dupree's expression was hard. "If they are passing knowledge," he said, "we risk losing control. We must act before this escalates." François Beaumont nodded. "But what do we do?" he asked. "Any heavy-handed action could provoke rebellion, and that would be dangerous for everyone." Émile considered the history. They had maintained a secret arrangement for decades, allowing names and lineage to persist in private and church records while keeping the public face of slavery intact. Now, the balance was threatened. "We act subtly," he said. "We observe, we intervene quietly, and we ensure no one gains leverage over us." Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste sensed the growing tension. He convened a meeting along the bayou with Pierre and Louis. The air was thick with summer humidity, the cypress trees casting long shadows over the water. "The owners suspect," he said quietly. "We must be careful, but we cannot stop teaching." Pierre frowned. "If they act against us," he said, "it could be disastrous." Louis shook his head. "We have survived worse. We have knowledge. We have memory. That is power. We teach, we preserve, and we remain vigilant." Jean-Baptiste nodded. "We will adapt," he said. "Every signal, every story, every lesson must be more careful now. But we cannot abandon what is essential." Tensions reached a breaking point when a young girl from the Dupree quarters was overheard repeating the family lineage to another child from a neighboring plantation. The overseer reported it immediately. This was no longer subtle. The plantation owners decided to confront the families directly. Émile Desnoyers went to the quarters accompanied by François and Jacques. They entered the shaded area near the cabins, the air tense with anticipation. Jean-Baptiste stepped forward. "We hear you are concerned," he said calmly. Émile's voice was firm. "There are reports of coordination," he said. "Teaching, gatherings, passing down knowledge. This cannot continue without our permission." Jean-Baptiste met his gaze steadily. "Knowledge cannot be hidden forever," he said. "Our children must learn who they are. We do not act out of disrespect, only out of survival." A long silence hung over the group. The plantation owners realized that these families were not fearful, not subservient in the way they had expected. They were cautious, yes, but also confident in their understanding of history and lineage. Philippe, who had been observing from the house, stepped forward. "Father," he said quietly, "perhaps we can find a solution that preserves order without crushing them." Émile looked at his son. "What do you propose?" he asked. Philippe took a deep breath. "We acknowledge their knowledge," he said. "We allow controlled teaching of skills and stories under supervision. We reinforce respect for the property, but we do not attempt to erase identity. This way, we maintain control while avoiding open conflict." Émile considered this. It was risky, yes, but direct confrontation could lead to violence and disruption of the plantation. Perhaps this is the best compromise. Over the following weeks, a delicate truce formed. The enslaved families continued teaching children and preserving history, but with caution. The plantation owners maintained control but allowed limited autonomy, recognizing the futility of attempting to erase centuries of lineage and memory. Jean-Baptiste reflected on the events. They had faced threats, suspicion, and potential violence, yet they had navigated the danger without losing their identity. Knowledge had become a weapon, subtle but powerful, shaping the next generation. In the quarters, the children continued learning. Songs carried hidden meanings, stories preserved essential truths, and skills ensured survival. Every lesson was a thread connecting past, present, and future. Philippe continued documenting everything privately. He understood the importance of preserving these stories, of recording the subtle revolts and acts of courage. He realized that history, carefully observed and written, could survive even if the public record denied it. The plantation remained tense but stable. Both sides had recognized the limits of power. The enslaved families had demonstrated resilience and strategy. The owners had learned caution. And Philippe stood as a witness to both worlds, understanding the complexity of justice, power, and memory. The stage was set for the final chapter. The secrets of Bayou Teche, the hidden histories, and the quiet resistance would soon converge, revealing truths that had been buried for generations and shaping the fate of those who had preserved them. If this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves untold histories and family secrets. Leave your city or state in the comments to show how far this story travels. The hidden legacies of Bayou Teche connect generations across time and continue to teach lessons in courage and memory. If you want, I can write part 10 next, the final and climactic part, where all secrets are revealed, and the fates of the plantation families, the enslaved families, and Philippe converge in a dramatic conclusion. Do you want me to continue with part 10? Part 10. The truth emerges. Some truths cannot be hidden forever. On Bayou Teche in 1861, the careful balance that had protected generations of secrets finally began to unravel. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of sugarcane and earth, the quiet of the bayou broken only by the croak of frogs and the occasional splash of fish. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers knew the time had come. Years of careful teaching, secret signaling, and preservation of memory had prepared the children. The younger generation was ready to inherit more than skills, they were ready to inherit the truth. It began with a gathering under the cypress trees, the same place where whispers had traveled for decades. Families came from neighboring plantations, quietly, cautiously. Each carried knowledge, songs, and stories that had been passed down from elders. Jean-Baptiste stood in the center, looking at the faces of children and adults alike. Today, he said, we speak of who we are. The children listened, eyes wide. The elders recounted the old colonial laws, the manumission papers hidden in the Desnoyer strongbox, and the arrangements that had kept them enslaved despite the legal right to freedom. Every story was measured, precise, designed to teach without provoking the dangerous curiosity of overseers. Meanwhile, Philippe Desnoyers watched from a distance. He had been keeping his own notes, recording the stories, and realizing the enormity of what had been preserved in the quarters. The enslaved families had maintained a living history far richer than any ledger, far more accurate than any public record. Philippe understood that he was witnessing a form of resistance that would endure long after his family, long after the plantations, long after slavery itself. But tension could not remain invisible forever. The plantation owners had noticed subtle defiance, and fear was building. Émile, François, and Jacques gathered again to discuss the growing unrest. We cannot ignore this, Émile said. Their knowledge is becoming dangerous. François shook his head. Dangerous? He asked. They do not act violently. They teach, they remember. How can memory itself be a threat? Jacques grimaced. Because knowledge empowers, he said. Because if one child understands the truth, others will learn too. And then control is lost. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. A local magistrate, hearing rumors of gatherings and unusual teaching, arrived at the Desnoyer plantation with the sheriff. He demanded to know what the families were doing, why children were learning about names and history instead of obeying orders. Jean-Baptiste stepped forward, calm but resolute. We teach skills, he said. We teach stories of survival. We do not incite rebellion. We preserve memory, which is our heritage. The magistrate, unfamiliar with the subtle codes and oral histories, pressed for a definitive answer. Philippe intervened. These teachings, he said, are harmless and structured. They ensure skills and traditions are passed to the next generation. There is no threat to public order. The magistrate left, but the confrontation revealed a dangerous truth. The stories and names could no longer remain entirely secret. The delicate arrangement that had preserved the hidden histories for generations was under scrutiny. Jean-Baptiste convened the families again. This is the moment we feared, he said. They know there is something. But we will survive. We will preserve our history, no matter what. The enslaved families acted with caution but clarity. They emphasized discretion, teaching children to pass down knowledge verbally, in song, in work, and in everyday gestures. Every lesson was encrypted in plain sight. Every story preserved a truth that could not be legally erased. Philippe, now fully aware of his moral responsibility, made a decision. He would begin quietly helping the families where possible, offering protection, preserving stories in writing for the future, and ensuring that the knowledge could survive outside the bayou even if the plantations fell into chaos. Months passed. The storm of confrontation had passed, but the legacy of knowledge had taken root. Children grew more confident in their skills, in their understanding of who they were, and in the stories of their ancestors. Every barrel, every song, every whispered story reinforced identity and resilience. And then the world changed. The Civil War began. Louisiana, along with the rest of the South, would face upheaval that no one could control. Plantations would be abandoned, families displaced, records destroyed. But the living history, preserved in memory and skills, survived. The names, Desnoyers, Beaumont, Dupree, continued through the enslaved families, carrying hidden truths and connections to their past that no law could erase. Jean-Baptiste, Pierre, and Louis watched as the children they had trained grew into young adults. They would inherit a world full of danger, opportunity, and uncertainty. Yet they also inherited knowledge, identity, and a deep understanding of their lineage. They carried the truth of Bayou Teche, the hidden histories, and the quiet defiance that had sustained generations. Philippe, reflecting on what he had witnessed, understood the paradox of power. The plantation families had tried to control the past, but memory could not be contained. The enslaved families, through careful teaching, subtle strategy, and relentless courage, had preserved a truth that would outlive the sugarcane, the ledgers, and even the Civil War. As night fell over Bayou Teche, the cypress trees cast long shadows over the water, and the air smelled of wet earth and sugar. The final lesson was clear: even in oppression, knowledge is power. History is survival, and names, passed down with care, can carry freedom in ways the world may never fully understand. This concludes the story of Bayou Teche, of hidden names, of secret manumissions, and the families who defied history to preserve their heritage. If this story captured your imagination, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves untold histories, secrets, and stories of resilience. Leave your city or state in the comments to show how far this story reaches. The hidden legacies of Bayou Teche continue to connect generations, teaching us courage, memory, and the quiet power of survival.